Hello, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be hosting this next part of Lead Different with Innivee Strategies. My name is Shane Feldman. This is my sign name. And I am thrilled to welcome Debra Russell, who will be taking a moment to introduce herself in just a bit. But before we start, I'd like to thank the interpreters today. Our sponsor for this event are providing captioning and voice interpretation for this, so I'd like to thank the interpreters very much for their support. And I'd like to let you all know that today we're focusing on a topic that Debra Russell is really well known and recognized for around the world: leadership in interpreting. She is well respected by both the interpreting and deaf communities for her leadership in interpreting, and that, I feel, is a very important topic today. What does leadership in interpreting look like? So, with that said, I'd like to turn it over to Debra for a brief introduction about who she is, her experience, and what she's done with leadership in the interpreting world. Thank you for joining us, Debra. Can you tell us a little about yourself?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here and I appreciate the opportunity. When it comes to introducing myself, I start with stating that I am an interpreter. In my heart, I am still an interpreter. I work actively as an interpreter. I have also had many opportunities within the deaf community as an interpreter. Part of that is I became a teacher, taught interpreting students. I'm a researcher, a writer. I've published articles related to interpreting. So I have three hats that I wear: interpreting, teacher, and consultant. And yes, I have been involved in many different organizations over the years. Some roles were in leadership. Some of those leadership roles I willingly stepped up to take, and some of those leadership roles were bestowed upon me. It has been a very long journey. And looking back over that journey, I started leadership with a deaf friend of mine within the local community. I was working in Edmonton, in Alberta, Canada at that time. And we had a young deaf person, my age, that was going on its own path. We formed a friendship, and over time, this individual became motivated to join a deaf organization's board. I saw him and his journey, sometimes interpreted for him, and he encouraged me to join an interpreter organization's board, which I did. That meant that both of us learned these leadership skills together. We supported each other in that journey. We shared successes and distresses. And we were able to solve problems together because the two of us had a foundation of a relationship and a friendship. We knew each other well. We had trust. And so he went on in his career to be a professional organization member, then the national level member. I also followed suit. He went on to join a deaf organization, eventually joined the World Federation for the Deaf, WFD, and he asked me to consider about joining as the first Northern American group as WASLI, WFD. So every time that he moved up the ladder, I also moved up the ladder with that mutual support. So that friendship is really what started my leadership journey.
That's a beautiful story of your relationship between two communities and that interplay between a leader in the deaf community and the interpreter community, both advancing together. What I'd like to learn more from you about is, as a deaf person, when I'm leading, I don't think about my job or my role very often and how that overlaps with what I'm giving. I just do what I do as a leader. But I have to recognize that for interpreters, it's a different environment, and I'd like to learn more about that. Before, we were discussing the importance of relationships in that context, and how can interpreters navigate their commitments to their profession, but at the same time support that goal of uplifting both the deaf and interpreting communities? How do you navigate that as a leader?
I wish there was an easy answer. There is not. For me, in terms of the journey, I think it's important for that interpreters to try leadership roles while understanding their why. What does a leader look like when you're also an interpreter? Sometimes it's easy to forget, oh, I'm a leader now, I'm not an interpreter. But no, you are always viewed as an interpreter. Even though I have a PhD and I teach, I'm always primarily viewed as an interpreter. And I want that awareness to influence my process and my decision making. So that means I'm always aware of my boundaries. I'm aware of how a certain action might be perceived by others. Will it look like I've overstepped my boundaries by the deaf community? Or will it look like I'm working in collaboration? One thing that I learned from Colin Allen, we were both presidents at the same time. He was president of WFD. I was president of WASLI, WASLI. We didn't know each other, so we had to build that relationship first before we could proceed. We had to learn how to trust each other. And the process was quick for us. But again, it really helped me to have clarity about what our role is within a certain space and what was not our business. When it was time to lead and when it was time to support. And that is sometimes a challenge for many interpreter leaders. They don't identify when it's a moment to step back and support and when it's a moment to step up and lead on a certain issue. So again, it requires conversations, and you have to be open to feedback. All of us are human. We will make mistakes. We will overstep our boundaries, and people will view us as breaking our ethics or stepping into other people's business. So you always have to remain open to feedback and be willing to reflect and make changes and apologize. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, yes. Yes, it does. I think you touched on an important topic, which is that interpreters oftentimes view themselves as having a transactional relationship with the deaf community, where it almost looks like a deaf person has gone into a store to buy something that the interpreter has made, some shiny copper thing, and now that they've got it, that should be good enough. It's all over. But that's not what things look like here. It's a lot deeper. It's very layered with a lot of meaning and a lot of intersections and a lot of issues that arise. So I'm wondering how interpreters can look within themselves with respect to that and untangle that idea of a transactional relationship from who they are and to move to a space that's more relationship based. I think that's an important part of community building. For example, the two of us have built our relationship over time. You've interpreted for me before, but we've also worked together in leadership roles too. So, what does that look like, building relationship? And what can we do about that belief that, oh, no, I can't step over that line because this is transactional?
That's one of my primary concerns when I look at our field today. I see more often that interpreters are having this transactional relationship with the deaf community. It's about business. If they want interpreting services, they should be paid for that interpreting service. It's about a transaction. But that's never been my frame or my view of the work. For me, interpreters have to start with the relationship. You can't lead and you can't influence without that foundation of a relationship. If it's always about the money and business and transacting without the relationship, how can you resolve problems together? For me, it just doesn't work like that. The transactional part is something we need to really reassess our time spent with the deaf community and look at how we can improve those relationships. For me, that's primary. And the transactional part, I am a little worried that sometimes it's the message that we are giving to interpreters when we train them in programs. Sometimes I've heard from young interpreters that tell me they've had a teacher in the past that told them not to socialize with the deaf community, which is shocking. It's not appropriate. You can't work effectively as an interpreter without having a relationship, I think. So if you are teaching and you're teaching it about it being a transaction, you are hurting both communities.
Yeah, well, that's a really powerful observation and an important one. I appreciate you bringing that up and acknowledging it. I'd like to talk about the interpreters in the community. I'm wondering how they can develop the capacity for leadership within themselves and then within the wider interpreting space. Because in the interpreting profession in general, there aren't a lot of opportunities for leadership. For example, when I'm working in an organization, I can set my sights on a particular leadership role and work toward it. And even in a volunteer organization, I can do the same thing. But in the interpreting profession, are there any leadership roles there? And if so, what do they look like? And how does a person build that ability for leadership within themselves and practice it in the interpreting world?
Good question. I think leadership starts with leading yourself. For me, as a working professional, it doesn't matter if I'm teaching or I'm interpreting or researching, I need to lead myself, which means I need to plan how to elevate my skills as much as possible. So if I'm an interpreter, I need to set goals to improve my skills. I need to continuously learn. And there are things about leading myself that means I need to be open to learning and open to feedback. I need to have that growth mindset to be able to see the opportunities that are out there. When I have an open mind, then you can find ways to contribute and support things in the field. I think oftentimes interpreters graduate their programs and then that's it. They have no other goal. They just work as an interpreter. But if you look at the interpreting profession, we need action, we need collaboration. And many of those opportunities are present within professional organizations. But I think sometimes people don't see themselves as a leader. They doubt themselves, but they can do it. They can learn those skills and then they can apply to the professional organization. I'm always encouraging interpreters to continue learning. It doesn't matter if it's a goal to get certified or to become a master's student in a program. Whatever the goal is, you should have a path where you see yourself progressing and growing along that path. There are many opportunities within the interpreting organizations, and as well, there are opportunities within deaf organizations. You can learn leadership skills there. For example, in the program where I taught interpreting students, I often had them go volunteer their time. And through that volunteer time, they would learn skills like how to organize an event or how to run a meeting in the deaf cultural norm style, or to see how deaf folks use sign language to resolve conflict. Those are many skills that you can apply to leadership that are learned from and with the deaf community. So, yeah, there are opportunities out there, of course, to establish your own business or to become a leader within the college or the university environment. You could become a trainer of interpreters, but really it comes back to starting at the local level. What are the problems that are present and how can you contribute to improving the environment for future interpreters within that community?
I think that's very well said. Um, Interpreters have to lead themselves, but at the same time take advantage of opportunities to get involved with different groups to develop their leadership skills. I'm wondering about you, Deborah. Um, for example, when I am developing my ability as a leader, I will read about it, I'll often talk to people about it, and almost by osmosis, I take things in by observing others. And that's all become a part of who I am and my values. In thinking about you, obviously you've arrived at a point where a lot of these things are within you now. How can interpreters take some of what you've learned and incorporate that in themselves? And so it doesn't look like, oh, I'm a leader now, I'm just going to lead, but being more intentional about it, that foundational piece of it, the principles behind leadership and the understanding of what a good leader looks like and what an ineffective leader looks like. I imagine that was part of your upbringing as an interpreter.
Sometimes I look back and I see how I have learned from various mentors in the past. I saw good deaf leaders and good interpreter leaders. I saw not effective leaders and not effective interpreter leaders. So I was able to learn through mentorship. But just like you, Shane, I love to read, I love to take classes. And today, interpreters have access to training resources online 24/7. So there really is no excuse. And I don't mean to judge, but there is no reason not to be engaged in learning, whether it's about time management, project management, strategic planning, communication, and problem solving. The list goes on and on. All of those resources are out there available and ready for you. Wasley, about 2 years ago, had a board that developed a leadership course for interpreter leaders within the African continent. So they picked, I think, about 20 interpreter leaders from a variety of countries across the continent, and they worked with these interpreters online. I am really curious to see what the results of this. I hope to go to Rwanda for the next conference, and I would love to see how they are progressing. But again, our message here is always to lead with and support from the deaf community. You can't veer off on your own. You have to work with the deaf community. Again, I think there's some well-designed courses that are specifically, like you said, it's complex when it comes to interpreter leaders and how they're viewed in the deaf community as leaders. It's multi-layered. You can't just, this doesn't show up for other leaders in other fields where they can just take classes and apply it easily. Here, there's so many layers. It's multicultural interactions. There's history involved, and sometimes that history is not positive. So how do you detach from that history and learn to start fresh and keep the ball rolling?
I'm wondering, I think you brought up a fantastic point that I'd like to build on. I'm wondering what your perspective is on this. As a deaf person who interacts often with members of the deaf community across the United States and different countries all over the world, if an interpreter comes into a situation in a leadership role, in general, the deaf community responds with a little bit of skepticism, mistrust, and resistance. And that resistance comes from a space of trauma, with coming from previous experiences where those people felt like trust was broken and felt vulnerable in a space with an interpreter that had power and privilege in a given situation. And so I'm curious what you think about going forward, what interpreters can do, assuming that they come into a space with good intentions, that they are well trained, and all of the things that you've described, ready to do right by the community, ready to do right by the profession. And then they enter and experience resistance from the deaf community. How do they address that kind of issue? What can they do first to acknowledge that, and also to bring down the barriers and rebuild trust with the deaf community? What do you think that looks like?
It's an important question. I think for me, if there's resistance, I want to dig in a little deeper and understand why there's resistance. Now, if there's some history and trauma, I want to know that history. I need to know so that I can communicate the other individual face to face in an effective way, not through email or text, but face to face, eye to eye, communicating with deaf individuals about what it is that we're trying to do, what it is they want us to do, and how we can work together and have a new start. Trust is not instantaneous. I mean, it rarely happens quickly. Colin and I built trust very quickly when I look back on our experience. I'm not quite sure why, but it happened. We had a path that was very similar, and we were able to identify how those similarities made us stronger together, and we were able to build that trust. But if there's a history of resistance, that means that interpreters need to be very visible within the deaf community. They need to be very open-minded to listening about what had happened with the past leaders that caused harm. And I think sometimes it's really hard for people to apologize, but apologizing is powerful. cleaning up the past, because you cannot build trust without effective, right communication. And it's not just about meeting and having serious conversations, but getting out and having fun together, seeing each other as people, as humans. I think that's how you can start to build some of that relational trust. And maybe some of that resistance will dissipate when they see that you're keeping your word. I mean, that you're doing the things that you're supposed to be doing.
No, that's true. That does build trust, keeping your word and your promises. Absolutely.
And I think it needs to involve compassion and empathy throughout the process, involving multiple perspectives. If we come in thinking that we are the leader and we're not interested in other people's experience and perspectives, you're already on the wrong path as a leader. Without that compassion and that human aspect, it's not going to work.
Agreed. That's wonderful and well said. So I'd like to reverse things and look at it from the other side now. We put a lot of burden and expectations on interpreter leaders in this conversation. And what do you think the interpreting world would like to see from the deaf community to help and contribute to building collaboration in leading together? What can we do as the deaf community to honor and respect the profession and what it contributes and build that commitment to what the future can look like if we work together?
That's a great question. When I've been fortunate to travel to different countries, what interpreters often tell me points back again to misunderstanding each other. I think interpreters want to feel like they can contribute to being part of the discussion. I think sometimes interpreters feel like their opinions and their experiences are dismissed because they are just an interpreter. Just an interpreter. Maybe we need to have a better framing to be able to build that trust and that relationship. I think also mutual respect is important and some kind of empathy related to interpreting as a human activity and how people will make mistakes. There will be cultural mishaps. And unfortunately, there will be some ethical problems within many communities. I think ethics sometimes is not an ethical problem, but more of a cultural problem. Misunderstanding and hurt and trauma and feelings that may not be related to the code of ethics, but they are related to that interactional relationship skill. So again, I think interpreters want the deaf community to view their work as complex. And they want the deaf community to provide support for their learning as well. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it does. I mean, you really captured something there that I'd like to build on that was very interesting. You said that there are ethical issues, but really the problem is more about the culture within the profession. And that culture is related to building relationship. Would you mind briefly expanding on that a little more?
I'm not sure of your experience, Shane, but much of my work involves working with deaf people from a variety of different backgrounds. There's no one size fits all, but I think, again, maybe we are training our new interpreters to think that there is one size interpreter and one size deaf person. When I'm seeing the folks in Canada that are deaf, they're moving here from different countries. They have different cultural experiences, different sign languages, different experiences with institutions like the police or the court system. All of that is very complex, which requires me to know something about them and their framing. Without that, I would just imagine them as a regular deaf person. But what even is a regular deaf person? Nowadays, we have so many cultures out there. It's beautiful. It's diverse. So within that, intersectional identity, that in and of itself is complex. And that, for me, is the start of the challenge. The code of ethics maybe comes later, but primary is understanding that person and having them understand me and the way I practice the work. Sometimes when I show up to an interpreting job, I ask the hearing person if they have had any experience working with a sign language interpreter before. If they say yes, I ask them what that looked like. I'm not going to assume that that previous interpreter practiced the work the same way that I practice the work. I ask deaf people the same question. What has your experience been with sign language interpreters in the past? So without that, again, that relationship, you won't be able to discuss conflict when it happens.
Absolutely. My contribution to what you've said, I'd like to build on that, and that was fantastic. It is really important that interpreters see every deaf person that they've never met before as a new opportunity to build relationship and earn trust. I believe that it is all too common to see someone say that because I'm friends with so and so, because I have a relationship with so and so, I should be given respect as an interpreter. And oftentimes I'll challenge that and say that doesn't matter. I am a deaf person, and this is a new opportunity for you to learn how to become part of and support a community and earn my trust. And if you don't see it that way because of your relationship with whoever or whatever else you have going on out there, if you're a respected researcher or professor or leader, it doesn't matter what the role is. That doesn't matter to me. Because again, you need to see me as a deaf person with value and life experience and a background. And this isn't just about me, but about every deaf person out there. We don't know what their stories are or what their lives are like. And I think that's a unique challenge for interpreters to learn how to earn trust from every deaf person they interact with, meet, and partner with in the future.
I think interpreters also need to be sometimes more aware that every moment during an interaction, they are on. They have to behave like they're building those relationships and trust. If they are egotistical and they just walk in and have no interest in building that relationship, people will already be turned off. Why would they trust someone like that? So the attitude and the actions and how we show up in every moment is important because we are viewed as an interpreter always. It might even be a social situation. You will still be viewed as an interpreter. You are still there building relationships. So I think that awareness of, think twice, right? This is a great opportunity to connect. How can I connect in a way that builds trust versus how can I connect in a way that builds disconnection? Because sometimes that does happen. How we communicate and how we interact will cause people to become resistant to us and want to disengage. So we need to really be reflecting on that.
I'd like to build on that idea of relational leadership. I think it's a foundational skill, and it has to happen every day for every interpreter, regardless of whatever assignment they're in. But that foundational skill is especially critical in moving up into a leadership role. I want to include in them the things that make Debra Russell, all of the knowledge, values, and support gained through that foundational skill of focusing on each person as an individual. For example, that story about Glenn, you built a relationship with them, and then your relationship with the next person. And every new person you built thereafter eventually grew into a leadership role. It grew into a culture around you where we could consider what we want the community to look like, partnership between the deaf and hearing worlds. I'd like to know what you think about that, but unfortunately I have to close, so these are going to have to be your final thoughts before I wrap up. But I'm wondering what you think about that.
Final comments are always a challenge. But I think when interpreters are conscious about building relationships and are really intentional about trying to establish healthy, positive relationships, I think that's the start. And recognizing that it won't happen immediately with some people. especially some communities where, like you've mentioned, there's a lot of trauma and negative history. But again, each of us can lead ourselves, which means that my actions may open the door for the next conversation to build a relationship with this new interpreter and this new person. So figure out what it is that you can do in each moment to build leadership relationships. And then that leadership role will progress. And I think that being not just a little bit conscious, but very conscious that you are being watched and that you are responsible for being a role model for those relationship building skills.
That is such a beautiful statement. Thank you again, Debra Russell, for coming here today and sharing your wisdom and experience with leadership and all the work that you've done over many years and will likely continue to do for a long time, and your commitment to partnership and building trust within our communities and collaborating together to build a future that we would love to see. So thank you again, Debra Russell. Thank you everyone for watching us today on Lead Different, you interpreter leaders who are collaborating with the deaf community. Thank you again to the interpreters today for your support with this event. Our sponsors have provided voice interpretation and captioning. We look forward to seeing you again at the next Lead Different. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone.